was always supposed to be an in-person exhibit, and then obviously there's an online version. It came about basically late last spring. They reached out to me and probably a dozen other people and said, we're just trying to generate ideas of what we could do to help people understand COVID better. And Museum of Science, which of course prides itself, and rightly so, as an entity that really promotes science education, it wants to be a source of important information for the community. And so we brainstormed a bunch of ideas, and this idea of a hologram was not even an idea I came up with. I just literally, I don't remember the ideas I gave, but clearly none of them were that interesting because they didn't do any of them. Then they came back to me like a month later and said, we want to do this thing. And basically it would be Ask Dr. Jha questions about COVID. And I said, okay, how would this work? And I thought it was gonna be like some sort of live thing where every couple of weeks or something I take questions for an hour or two. And they were like, no, you come in, we pre-record about 600 to 800 questions, and then we have a hologram of you answering these questions. And there's an exhibit like at the museum, and they showed me the physical space. I spent 2 days in June. And they were long days, but I sat in sat in my chair and just answered questions. And most of them were about COVID. There was the occasional question about like my family, my kids, my favorite color, et cetera. And I didn't really know like how it would come out. And then it was about a month and a half later when the museum opened, but there was an online version, that I realized these guys did an extraordinary job. I mean, the AI technology behind it is unbelievable, because basically, as you know, Wayne, you can ask almost any question you want, and it's really accurate at figuring out what question you asked.
Yeah, it's totally amazing. I mean, if you're interested in AI just in general, in addition to coronavirus, it's just a wonderful introduction to it. And you had to go back and you spent a day updating, I guess would be the word, recently, last week, as I recall. So you spent what, 8 hours updating because a lot had happened?
7, 8 hours. And there were two parts of it. That one was because the exhibit had been both online and in person, there had been a bunch of questions that had come up that the system couldn't answer because I hadn't given any answers to those questions. Questions about vaccines, questions about, I don't even remember a lot of other, there were some questions about like the Red Sox. But obviously, given how fast changing it is, there were a bunch of questions they were seeing that I had not answered. So they wanted me to address those. And then there were a bunch of questions where I had given an answer, which was correct as of June, but the world had changed. We had learned more, right? Even about some of the issues around transmission, some of the issues around therapies. In June, I had said, I am hopeful that we might at some point get treatments for X. Well, now we do have it. And so that stuff just didn't feel fresh anymore, which makes sense, right? If you walk in today and say, ask me a question, and I say, I'm hopeful at some point we will have X, but we already have it, that's going to feel weird. And so they asked if I would come back and do a refresh of both updating it with new knowledge, but also answering questions that had come up that we had not anticipated. And so I did both, and it was great. And we'll see what they produce. It usually takes them a few weeks because there's a lot of production stuff that goes into it. And so I think by early mid-February, we will have the more updated version. And the only tricky part of it, Wayne, I'll give you a little insight, was that I had to wear exactly the same clothes because these questions are all interchangeable. So you can't have me changing clothes between questions. It'll be. And so I had to make sure I had exactly the same suit, the same tie, the same shirt.
Go ahead, your 3-minute life story.
Yeah, so I was born in India. I was born in Bihar, which is really the sort of one of the poorest, maybe the poorest state of India. One of the, when my parents, when I was 9, basically had the classic immigrant, this is a really hard place to raise our kids. I mean, Bihar at that point was like incredibly corrupt, incredibly, it just wasn't a great place. I mean, great like culturally and socially, but from a opportunity point of view. And so they did what a lot of immigrant parents and immigrants have done. They packed their bags and they actually initially moved to Toronto, where my dad had gotten into grad school at the University of Toronto, and that was sort of the ticket out. And my mom and my brother and I have one sibling, we followed. Spent from the ages of 9 to 14 in Toronto. It's where I learned English. So I showed up to Toronto as a 9-year-old, not speaking a word of English, and learned English, learned baseball, learned to love the Toronto Blue Jays.
We won't hold that against you.
Yeah, I was gonna say I have over time. Part of it is, I'm not a fair weather fan of the Red Sox. I feel like I've been in in New England since 1992. So I don't know. After like a decade or two, you can call yourself a real fan. But so and then when I was 14, my family moved to New Jersey. Went to high school in New Jersey. I went to college in New York. I went to med school for all the reasons that you never say to people on the medical school interviews why you're really going. The real reason I went to med school was because my parents really wanted me to go to medical school. They really wanted one of their kids, and my older brother was having none of it. And so I went to medical school, came up to Harvard for medical school. And I have to say, this is, a weird thing. I fell in love with medicine. Like I showed up a little bit begrudgingly, and within about 6 months decided this was the coolest thing ever. I loved learning medicine. I loved like this, the demystification of all this stuff, these diseases. And I just really enjoyed it. And the other thing was in college, I had done a lot of work on human rights. I had been very, very interested in policy issues. And so in medical school, decided to take some time, start doing policy research. Took a year off, did that, went out to California for training, came back, and then met my wife. And I will quickly speed up here, but met my wife out in California. And before we were married, we were together, and I basically convinced her to come back to Boston for what I promised was a 2-year stint. And then we would go back to California. She's originally from Ohio, but really loved California. And so in 2002, I persuaded her to come to Boston with me. And I thought it was gonna be a 2-year fellowship, and then I was gonna go back to UCSF. And instead, found a fabulous mentor at Harvard named Arnie Epstein, changed my life thinking about academic research. And I stayed on as faculty at Harvard. And, I will say one quick thing, because this really has guided me. Even around the time I was trying to decide, do I want to have an academic career? And I remember one day sitting in Arnie's office and saying, I actually have decided I don't want to be an academic. And he's like, why? I said, because so much of academic research just doesn't make a difference. It's like you write the paper, it goes on your CV, but the world doesn't move. And Arnie has always been somebody who said, well, that means you got to go out and do research that does make a difference. You got to figure out how to make the world move based on data and evidence. And I've used that as an inspiring kind of notion of I've been deeply involved in policy really since 2004, 2005. During the ACA debates, I was probably in DC, 2 days a week. I've always been very, very interested in the kind of the application of the science, not just the science itself. And then in 2014, the president of Harvard at that time, Drew Faust, asked me to run the Global Health Institute. And it felt like a new challenge. I was excited to do it. And I started. And the quick thing I'll say about that is it was right in the middle of the Ebola outbreak of West Africa. And I chaired a commission to look at that and what happened. And through that work, Wayne, in 2015, became very, very alarmed that the world was heading towards having a global pandemic, and we were not ready. And so from 2015 through 2020, really, put a lot of effort and resources of the Harvard Global Health Institute towards trying to get the world ready. Now, I would say that we largely failed because a lot of the things we pushed for never happened. But we certainly tried our best to raise awareness and say to people, this is coming, this is going to be bad, and we have to act. And and we made a lot of progress in the last days of the Obama administration. And then almost everything that we and others were proposing were ripped up by the Trump administration. So last few years were tough, but a lot of it was focused on that. And then just to finish up the story, in early 2020, in January, got a phone call from Chris Paxson and then Rick Locke, the president and provost of Brown, who said, "You want to come to Brown?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm pretty happy." And they said, "It's a great university, it's a great community, and you have a chance to build a great school of public health." And as we talked more, I became more and more excited. And I said yes, and then more or less like 3 weeks later, the world shut down and the pandemic happened, and the rest you know much better. It's very clear. But so that's my story. And the only couple other updates I'll add is, so yes, I'm married. Same woman who I strong-armed into coming to Boston with me has stuck with me. And
what's her name and what does she do?
Her name is Deborah, and she's a environmental lawyer. Okay. And until about a year ago, was working at Harvard Law School, actually, on climate and law stuff. And it's really just a, I mean, obviously I'm so biased. She's my wife, but a pretty brilliant thinker on a lot of this stuff. And we have 3 children. My oldest is 15. The next one just turned 14. And then our youngest is 9.